At 2,200 hours on August 23, 1944, Sergeant Bob Tompkins crouched behind a Norman hedgerow outside Brest, inflating a rubber Sherman tank 2 kilometers from German 88s that could vaporize him in a single shot. 27 years old. For deception operations behind him. 0 real tanks destroyed. And tonight, he was supposed to make the Germans believe that 2 entire American tank battalions were assembling to crush their right flank. All with 1,100 men and inflatable rubber. The air compressor rattled against the ground as the collapsed Sherman began to swell, full size, 93 pounds, a perfect silhouette of a 33-ton tank that would fold like wet cardboard if anyone leaned on it. From 800 yards away, German artillery observers watched from the church tower in Gusnau. Tompkins had spotted them earlier, 2 silhouettes, steady, methodical, binoculars trained on his field. Probably calling in coordinates. Probably confused, or alarmed, or both. The Ghost Army carried almost no real weapons. No artillery. No armor. No heavy guns. Just carbines. 50 calories machine guns, and the most unlikely tools of war. Inflatable tanks that looked real at long range. Sound trucks loaded with vinyl recordings of Sherman engines and sergeants shouting orders. Radio deception teams imitating entire battalions. Artists painting fake unit markings on jeeps under moonlight. Activated in January 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was an army of misfits and geniuses. Average IQ, 119. It included fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, photographer Art Kane, West Point officers, art school dropouts, actors, engineers, sound technicians, all thrown together for the strangest mission of World War II. They'd arrived in France 2 weeks after D-Day. First mission, create a fake Mulberry Harbor to draw artillery fire from the real one. Then Operation Fortitude, a phantom army to convince Hitler the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais. Now they were at Brest, undertaking their riskiest deception yet. 3 men in the Ghost Army had already been killed, 30 wounded. If the Germans figured out the ruse tonight, 1,100 lightly armed men would be facing 38,000 German troops alone. Tompkins glanced at his watch, 0230. 3.5 hours until dawn. 11 tanks still to inflate. Task Force X, 200 men masquerading as the 15th Tank Battalion. Needed at least 15 convincing Shermans in place before sunrise. Only 1 company of real tanks supported them. The rest was illusion. The pump jammed. Tompkins cussed, cleared the valve, restarted it. The rubber Sherman rose again. Turret, gun tube, hull, fake tracks, ridiculous up close, deadly convincing from 800 yards through a German Feldwebel's binoculars. At 0300, 13 tanks were standing. Private James Anderson, an auto mechanic from Virginia before the war, was dragging a bulldozer to carve fake tank tracks into the mud. The prints had to look heavy, deep, irregular, like dozens of real Shermans had repositioned in the night. Sound trucks rolled in at 0330. Speakers crackled to life. Sherman engines rumbling. Gearboxes grinding. Sergeants shouting. The metallic clank of tracks. Loud enough for German listening posts. Not loud enough to sound staged. The deception had worked. And now every one of those German guns was pointed directly at Sergeant Bob Tompkins and his rubber Shermans. 6 months earlier, on January 20th, 1944, the Ghost Army didn't exist at all. It was just an idea in a cramped office in London. Major Ralph Ingersoll stood over a table covered in reconnaissance photographs from North Africa. British deception operations against Rommel. Dummy tanks. Fake supply dumps. Phantom divisions that had pulled German armor miles away from real attacks. The Desert Fox had been fooled. Ingersoll slid the photos across the table to Colonel Billy Harris. "We need this," he said. For Normandy. The problem wasn't concept. It was scale. The Allies were planning the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 150,000 men hitting 5 beaches in a single day. Hitler had 50 divisions in France. If the Germans knew where and when the invasion would land, the war could be lost on the beaches. Deception wasn't new. George Washington had used it at Trenton. But the U.S. Army had never created an entire unit whose sole mission was lying to the enemy. No doctrine, no manuals, no equipment lists. They were inventing modern battlefield deception from nothing. Harris received approval in early January. Activate a special troops unit. Mission statement. Deceive the enemy about Allied strength and location. Save lives through illusion. The first challenge wasn't technology. It was people. Combat soldiers knew how to fight. Engineers knew how to build. But who knew how to lie convincingly under fire? Harris needed men who understood illusion. Artists who understood perspective and shadow. Sound engineers who could fake movement. Radio operators who could mimic communication habits. Actors who could play roles when discovery meant death. Recruitment began quietly in late January. Men were pulled from existing units. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, the 244th Signal Company, and new recruits with unusual resumes. Fashion designers, painters, photographers, set designers from Broadway. The average IQ of the unit, 119. Command went to Colonel Harry Reeder, a former armored infantry commander who understood maneuver warfare. Even he admitted later, "We were walking blind." There was almost no literature on tactical deception. Training was built from scratch at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Sims wrote the curriculum as they went. How to inflate a dummy tank in 20 minutes. How to paint insignia that fooled aerial reconnaissance. How to generate radio traffic that matched real divisions. How to act like another unit entirely. The equipment arrived in February. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear, under 100 pounds each, carried by 4 men, inflated with portable compressors. From 500 yards, they looked real. From 50 yards, they looked ridiculous. Sound equipment was experimental. Mobile trucks with massive speakers projecting noise 15 miles at night. Tank engines, artillery movement, shouted commands. Played only when German listening posts were active. Then came the most dangerous element, radio deception. Signal operators studied the habits of real divisions. Call signs, message structure, individual operator quirks. German intelligence didn't just listen for messages. They listened for patterns. The Ghost Army learned to replicate them perfectly. By April, the unit was operational. 1,100 men for elements. Visual deception engineers. Signal deception operators. Combat engineers for security. And the Sonic Company. But none of the officers knew if it would actually work. British deception in North Africa had relied on open desert. Normandy was hedgerows, villages, forests, and Germans who'd spent 4 years preparing defenses. On April 10th, an advance party flew to England. Their mission, integrate deception into the invasion plan. They had less than 2 months before D-Day. The main body sailed aboard the USS Henry Gibbons in early May. 13 days across the Atlantic. They landed in Bristol on May 15th. 2 weeks before the invasion, Operation Fortitude was already underway. The British were running the largest deception campaign in history. Fake armies, fake radio traffic, fake commanders. The Ghost Army was about to take deception closer to the front than anyone ever had. And by August 1944, that would put Sergeant Bob Tompkins, alone in a hedgerow outside Brest, inflating rubber tanks under the guns of a fortress that believed an entire armored force was coming for it. Fake army groups, phantom divisions. An entire illusion designed to convince Hitler the invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The Ghost Army was meant to support that lie. But Colonel Harry Reeder faced a problem that kept him awake at night. His men had trained in Tennessee. Quiet fields, controlled conditions, no enemy, no artillery. Now they would operate inside the range of German guns. If the deception looked fake, it failed. If it looked too real, the Germans would attack. And 1,100 men with light weapons could not survive a determined assault. Reeder needed to know one thing. Could a rubber army survive contact with the enemy? On June 6, 1944, at 6:30 a.m., the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Ghost Army wasn't there. While real soldiers died on Omaha and Utah, the deceivers sat in Stratford-upon-Avon, inflating practice tanks and listening to BBC broadcasts. They were furious. Trained, ready, and sidelined. 2 weeks later, on June 21st, the 1st Ghost Army detachment crossed the channel. 20 men. One mission. Simulate a Mulberry Harbor at night using lights. Draw German artillery away from the real artificial harbors at Arromanches. It almost worked too well. So many Allied lights already dotted the coast that their deception was lost in the noise. But the lesson was priceless. German artillery observers were watching, measuring, waiting for patterns. The full unit landed in France on June 23rd. They bivouacked near the beaches. The air still smelled of cordite. Burned-out tanks lay twisted in the hedgerows. This wasn't Tennessee anymore. Their first real test came in July. Operation Brittany. Patton's Third Army was racing east across France. The Germans had no idea where he was going. 4 divisions. Multiple axes of advance. Chaos. The Ghost Army would make it worse. They split into 4 task forces. Each one would simulate a different combat unit. 35th Infantry Division, 80th Infantry Division, 90th Infantry Division, 2nd Armored Division. The plan was elegant. Real divisions continued east. Fake divisions turned west and south into Brittany. Each task force was complete. Fake bumper markings. Fake shoulder patches. Fake radio nets. Men walked into cafes wearing the wrong insignia. Started conversations. Let slip accidental information. They hoped someone was listening. Someone always was. Captain George Rebbe commanded security. His job wasn't just protecting against Germans. It was protecting the deception from Americans. If friendly troops didn't know what was real, German intelligence wouldn't either. From August 9th to August 12th, the performance ran nonstop. Radio operators mimicked division-level communications. Sound trucks broadcast the noise of troop movements at night. Artists repainted vehicles daily. German intelligence intercepted the traffic. They reported 4 American combat teams moving into Brittany. Hitler's commanders repositioned forces to counter the threat. Meanwhile, Patton slipped past them. By the time the Germans realized the Brittany columns were fake, American armor was already approaching Paris. Success created a new danger. Higher command now believed the Ghost Army could do anything. Requests flooded in. Every corps commander wanted deception support. Most requests were impossible. Deception wasn't improvisation. It was choreography. Radio patterns had to be perfect. Sound volume had to match terrain. Visual displays had to align with observation posts and flight paths. One mistake exposed them. And exposure meant annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Day learned this at Brest. He volunteered to establish radio contact with notional units. Drove into the city under fire. Helped capture 300 German soldiers. He earned a Bronze Star. But he also saw the truth. If the Germans ever confirmed the deception's location, artillery would erase it in minutes. The men began to understand what they really were. Not combat troops. Not engineers. Bait. Private James Anderson wrote in his diary, "We're bait." He was right. Every operation required them to draw enemy attention. Every success pulled German guns closer. And now, in August 1944, outside Brest, Sergeant Bob Tompkins was inflating rubber tanks under the eyes of German observers. The deception had worked. The question was whether it would keep working long enough for everyone to survive. The Ghost Army's job was to look dangerous. That meant placing themselves exactly where the Germans were looking, forward of friendly lines, within artillery range, close enough for binoculars, spotters, and snipers. The officers reduced risk where they could. Guards were posted. Escape routes planned. Positions rotated frequently, but there was no way to make deception safe. Not when success depended on convincing the enemy they were staring at a high-value armored threat. By late August, as Sergeant Bob Tompkins inflated rubber Shermans outside Brest, the unit had already completed 5 deception operations. 0 men killed, 18 wounded, all from artillery fire. Random shells, not targeted strikes. Just the cost of being close to the front. The men knew the pattern wouldn't hold forever. Eventually, German intelligence would connect the dots. Units that appeared only at night. Radio traffic without attacks. Tank battalions that never advanced. When that happened, the Ghost Army wouldn't be bait anymore. It would be the target. And rubber tanks don't stop shrapnel. At dawn, Tompkins watched sunlight spread across the inflatable Shermans. From a distance, they looked lethal. Somewhere nearby, German gun crews were loading shells, setting elevations, preparing to destroy what they believed was an American armored battalion. The illusion was perfect. Now the men had to survive it. On August 25, 1944, at 0600 hours, 8 Corps attacked Fortress Brest. 2nd Infantry Division struck from the north. 8th Infantry hit the center. 29th Infantry pushed from the south. 75,000 Americans against 38,000 Germans. The Ghost Army had already done its work. German intelligence reported armored threats on both flanks. General Hermann Bernhard Ramke repositioned his defenses. Between 20 and 50 88mm guns shifted away from the main assault axis, aimed at positions where rubber Shermans had stood 12 hours earlier. But by then, Task Force X was gone. At 0400, they deflated the tanks, loaded them onto trucks, disappeared before first light. Standard procedure: create the illusion. Withdraw before the illusion kills you. The attack itself went badly. Ramke's paratroopers were dug in deeper than expected. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fire, prepared kill zones. American forces advanced 200 yards in 8 hours. 300 casualties on the first day, but intelligence assessments later showed the deception had mattered. Company D, 709th Tank Battalion, the same real company that had anchored Task Force X, reported lighter resistance on the right flank. The repositioned German guns had weakened the defense just enough. The Ghost Army hadn't won the battle, but it had tilted the odds. Brest fell on September 19th. 27 days of fighting. 10,000 American casualties. The German garrison killed or captured. Colonel Harry Reeder pulled his unit back to a base camp near Lesneven. The men needed rest. Equipment needed repair. Inflatable tanks were torn and patched. Sound equipment needed rewiring. Radio operators studied new enemy patterns. They didn't get much time. On September 8th, new orders arrived. Operation Bettenburg. Patton was pushing toward Metz. His front line was dangerously thin. A gap had opened between advancing units. If the Germans discovered it and counterattacked, they could sever an entire American division. The Ghost Army would fill the gap. 1,100 men pretending to be 15,000. This mission was different. At Brest, they had supported a real assault. At Bettenburg, they were the line. If the Germans probed, they wouldn't find infantry or armor. They would find actors, sound trucks, radios, and men hoping the illusion held. Lieutenant Robert Heller commanded the sonic element. His trucks rolled forward, engines quiet, speakers ready. They would make noise where no army existed. And if the Germans believed it, no one would ever know how close the line had come to breaking. Rewritten Part 5, cinematic documentary style. The plan was simple. Make noise where no army existed. Lieutenant Robert Hiller's sonic trucks rolled into position after dark. Speakers faced the tree line. Cables were buried. Engines shut down. At dusk, the recordings began. Tank tracks grinding over dirt. Infantry forming up. Officers shouting orders. Artillery being positioned. Not loud enough to sound fake. Just loud enough to be overheard. 2 kilometers away, German listening posts picked it up. The radio deception mattered even more. Signal company operators created an entire division from scratch. A headquarters. Battalions. Supply convoys. Recon patrols. Hundreds of transmissions every day. Routine traffic. Fuel requests. Maintenance complaints. Movement orders. All false. All precise. Every message followed real American protocols. Same call signs. Same phrasing. Same operator habits. Even the pauses between transmissions matched the rhythms of real units. German intelligence was listening and believing. Operation Bettenburg lasted 7 days. September 15th to September 22nd. 7 days of holding empty ground with nothing but sound and radio waves. German artillery fired sporadically into the sector. Harassment fire. Random volleys. Airburst shells. Not targeted strikes. Just enough to keep an occupied area under pressure. On the 4th night, 3 Ghost Army soldiers were wounded. 88mm airbursts. Shrapnel. Pure bad luck. They had been setting up a sonic truck when the shells came in. The fire wasn't aimed at them specifically. They just happened to be there. The deception held. German reconnaissance never discovered the gap. Patton's forces pushed forward. On September 22nd, real American units moved into position. The Ghost Army withdrew. Colonel Harry Reeder reviewed the after-action reports. 2 major operations completed. Brittany. Bettenburg. 0 catastrophic failures. 3 men killed. 48 wounded. Considering they had spent 6 weeks operating inside artillery range, the numbers were astonishing. But the cost wasn't just physical. The men were exhausted. Constant movement. Little sleep. Living in foxholes. Inflating tanks under observation. Broadcasting sound while shells fell. Radio operators transmitted fake messages knowing German intelligence was listening. knowing a single mistake could expose them. The psychological strain was relentless. Infantrymen fought back. The Ghost Army couldn't. Their job was to be seen, to draw fire, to become a target, and never shoot. And the missions were getting harder. Closer to the front. Shorter margins. Higher stakes. In December, they would face their greatest test. Hitler's last gamble. December 16, 1944. 0530 hours. German artillery opened fire across a 50-mile front in the Ardennes. 29 divisions. 250,000 men. Hitler's attempt to split the Allied armies in half. The Ghost Army was in Luxembourg, 60 miles from the breakthrough. Far enough to be safe. Close enough to matter. Within 12 hours, German tanks smashed through American lines. Entire battalions were surrounded. Communications collapsed. Nobody knew where the Germans were, or how far they'd advanced. General Omar Bradley needed time. He needed reserves. Most of all, he needed to keep the Germans from widening the breach. But every real division was already committed. There were no reserves. Except one. Bradley's staff proposed Operation Kodak. A radio-only deception. No inflatable tanks. No sound trucks. No visual displays. Just communications. The Ghost Army would invent reinforcements. Make German intelligence believe 2 full American divisions were moving south of the breakthrough. If the Germans believed it, they would divert forces. If they diverted forces, the offensive would slow. The danger was extreme. The front was fluid. Nobody knew where German units actually were. Setting up radio stations meant risking direct contact with advancing enemy forces. On December 19th, the transmissions began. Signal operators mimicked the 75th Infantry Division and the 6th Armored Division, 2 powerful formations that appeared to be rushing toward Bastogne. The fake 75th sent supply requests, movement orders, reconnaissance reports. The fake 6th Armored transmitted even more traffic. So much that German intelligence began plotting their movements on maps. The Ghost Army wasn't holding ground anymore. They were shaping the battlefield with nothing but voices and code. The radio traffic never stopped. Tank maintenance reports, fuel requisitions, artillery coordination messages. Hundreds of transmissions every day, each one suggesting the same thing. A major American armored force was assembling. German intelligence intercepted everything. Direction-finding units triangulated the signals. They plotted transmitter locations on maps, estimated unit size, tracked movement patterns. 2 divisions. Exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them to see them. German after-action reports would later confirm it. They believed American reinforcements were moving south. Belief created danger. If German commanders thought 2 divisions were arriving, they might strike first, hit the positions before those forces could organize. The radio operators understood that risk. They worked from trucks parked in frozen fields, engines off, antennas extended. Temperatures dropped below zero. Vacuum tubes cracked in the cold. Transmitters failed without warning. Batteries drained faster than expected. Men transmitted with numb fingers, wrapped in blankets. Knowing every signal made them more visible to German direction-finding equipment. Every message was bait. 30 miles north, the real battle raged. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. Low on ammunition. Low on food. No resupply. No reinforcements. Just orders to hold. General Patton was racing north with 3 divisions, but speed alone wasn't enough. He needed time. The Germans had to be delayed. Confused. Diverted. Operation Kodak provided that delay. For 4 days, German intelligence tracked phantom American divisions. They repositioned units, adjusted defensive lines, prepared to counter threats that didn't exist. While they watched empty fields, Patton's columns moved. By the time German analysts began questioning the radio picture, it was too late. On December 26th, Patton reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The German offensive stalled. Hitler's gamble failed. The Ghost Army's contribution left no visible trace. No photographs. No headlines. No public recognition. Radio deception didn't produce wreckage. But the commanders knew. Bradley knew. Simpson knew. Patton knew. 1,100 men with transmitters had helped save Bastogne. After Operation Kodak, the Ghost Army returned to routine deception missions. Operation Flaxweiler in January. Operation Landvalers in February. Each operation more refined, more precise, more dangerous. They learned what worked. Visual deception required clear sight lines. Sonic deception depended on terrain. Radio deception demanded perfect timing. They also learned the cost. Every successful deception made the next one harder. German intelligence was learning too, asking questions. Why did certain American units appear only at night? Why did some divisions transmit constantly but never attack? Why did armored battalions vanish without leaving wrecked vehicles behind? Patterns were emerging. Eventually, someone would connect the dots. When that happened, the Ghost Army would stop being bait and become the target. March 1945 brought their biggest mission yet, and their closest brush with disaster. March 18, 1945, 1,400 hours. Colonel Harry Reeder received orders for Operation Viersen. The Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before Germany's industrial heartland. If the crossing failed, the war could drag on for months. The Ghost Army would create the largest deception of the war. They would make the Germans believe the crossing would occur at Viersen, 15 miles north of the real site at Rheinberg. This time, nothing could be left to chance. Visual deception, sonic deception, radio deception, everything. They had 4 days, March 18th to March 21st, and the Germans were watching more closely than ever. The orders were simple. Set up positions. Inflate dummy equipment. Create supply dumps. Lay communication wire. Position sonic trucks. Establish radio networks. The scale was unprecedented. More than 600 inflatable vehicles were deployed. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, tank destroyers, all placed where German observation posts could see them, not randomly, in correct tactical formations, with realistic spacing, proper fields of fire, supply areas positioned exactly where a real army would place them. From the air, it looked like a full corps preparing to cross the Rhine. The Sonic Company went live first. Recordings played continuously. Tank engines starting. Vehicles maneuvering. Construction noise. Troops assembling. 24 hours a day. Loud enough to carry to German listening posts. Controlled enough to sound authentic. Then the radios came alive. Signal operators simulated 2 corps headquarters. Dozens of regimental and battalion networks followed. Thousands of transmissions flowed across the spectrum. Movement orders. Supply requests. Recon reports. Engineering updates. Every message reinforced the same conclusion. The Ninth Army was preparing to cross at Viersen. The deception began on March 21st. German artillery responded almost immediately. Heavy fire. 155mm shells slammed into the area. The heaviest bombardment the Ghost Army had ever endured. Within the first hour, 3 men were wounded. Shrapnel ripped through a radio truck. Transmitters destroyed. Antennas torn away. The operators moved to backup positions. They kept transmitting. German reconnaissance flights increased. Focke-Wulf 190s passed overhead every 6 hours. Cameras clicking. Pilots circling. Returning with photographs of tanks that did not exist. The Luftwaffe was paying attention. On March 23rd, the real crossing began. Not at Viersen. At Rheinberg, 15 miles to the south. Churchill tanks rolled forward. Amphibious vehicles entered the water. Combat engineers worked under fire. German resistance at Rheinberg was lighter than expected. Intelligence later confirmed why. German forces had been repositioned north. They were preparing to counter the crossing that wasn't happening. The deception worked. The Ninth Army established a bridgehead. Within 48 hours, more than 20,000 men were across the Rhine. General William Simpson, commander of Ninth Army, sent a commendation. The Ghost Army's deception had drawn German reserves away from the main effort. It had saved thousands of lives. The cost was real. 12 men wounded. More equipment destroyed than in any previous mission. German artillery shelled their positions for 3 straight days. The men had been operating continuously since March 18th. No sleep. Constant bombardment. Maintaining the illusion under fire. Operation Viersen was their final major deception. 3 weeks later, Germany would surrender. But in late March, no one knew that. The Ghost Army prepared for more missions. More inflatables. More radios. More nights pretending to be something they weren't. They had conducted 21 deception operations. France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany. They had fooled German intelligence repeatedly. Estimated lives saved, 15 to 30,000. And almost no one knew they existed. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. The Ghost Army survived. Final tally: 21 operations. 3 men killed. 48 wounded. 0 catastrophic failures. Every mission succeeded to some degree. None were fully exposed. On May 10th, Colonel Harry Reeder assembled the unit in a field near Luxembourg. 1,100 men stood in formation. He told them what came next. Their records would be classified, all documentation sealed, equipment destroyed or locked away. They would be sworn to secrecy. They could not discuss their missions. Not with family, not with other veterans, not with anyone. The reason was simple. The techniques were too valuable. Inflatable deception, sonic warfare, radio manipulation. The Army intended to use them again. The men signed secrecy agreements. Violation meant court-martial. They could not even admit they had served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. If asked, they were to say they had served in regular combat units. And for nearly 50 years, that is exactly what they did. The unit officially disbanded on June 23, 1945, exactly 1 year after arriving in France. The men boarded the USS General O. Ernst. 13 days crossing the Atlantic. The same journey in reverse. No bands, no speeches, no medals, just transport home. Most returned to civilian life immediately. Artists went back to art. Engineers returned to engineering. Bill Blass resumed work in New York. Ellsworth Kelly returned to Paris. Art Kane went back to photography and magazines. They carried no proof of what they'd done. No citations. No campaign streamers. No explanations. They were forbidden to talk. They couldn't explain the gaps in their service records. At veteran reunions, they listened. Stories of tank battles, infantry assaults, Normandy hedgerows, the Bulge. They stayed silent. Bob Tompkins went home to his family. He told them he'd served with an engineering unit in France. Nothing more. Nothing specific. His diary, written in violation of security regulations, was sealed in a box. Hidden. The secrecy lasted 50 years. In 1996, the Pentagon declassified the records. Historians finally saw the files. Operations, radio logs, after-action reports. The scale became clear. Filmmaker Rick Bayer found the story. He tracked down surviving veterans, recorded interviews. In 2013, a PBS documentary aired. For the first time, the Ghost Army became public knowledge. But most of the men were already gone. They had carried the secret their entire lives. They died without recognition, without anyone knowing what they had done. In 2024, 79 years after the war ended, Congress acted. The Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, was awarded to the Ghost Army. Only 3 veterans were still alive to attend. Seymour Nussenbaum, John Christman, Bernard Bluestein, all over 95 years old. At the ceremony, Senator Edward Markey spoke. These soldiers were not only men of muscle, he said. They were men of the mind. But most of the 1,100 men were not there. No family stood for them. No names were read. Their legacy was never meant to be loud. They didn't destroy tanks. They didn't capture cities. They didn't charge beaches. They made the enemy see what wasn't there. They turned imagination into a weapon. The Ghost Army saved lives by convincing the enemy to fire at shadows. They won battles by never fighting them. And for half a century, the world never knew.